Chapter 33. Zach pulled into Dani's driveway 47 minutes after he hung up with her. The first thing he'd done was to call the little diner that made takeout pizza, and placed an order. He hoped she still liked mushrooms and pepperoni. Then he'd rushed to gather a few things he hoped she'd like, then picked up the pizza and came straight here. He got out and grabbed the 2 grocery bags he'd brought, looping them over one arm while he carried the pizza with both hands. He reached the door and balanced dinner in one hand long enough to knock, not really expecting an answer but still wanting to warn her he was there and about to come in. Twisting the knob, he found it unlocked like she'd said. It opened easily and he went inside, closing it behind him. "I'm here," he called, expecting her to come from the back of the house. Without waiting, he carried the food into the kitchen, put it and the bags on the table, pulled a couple things out of one bag and put them into the fridge, and then glanced around. She should have come out, or at least said something by now. With a frown, he headed for the back of the house where the bedrooms were. "Dani?" He peeked into Mark's room, then into Dani's but found nothing. The door to the bathroom was closed, but he couldn't hear the shower. "Dani?" He stood outside the bathroom door and listened. Nothing. No movement, just silence. What if she'd fallen and hurt herself? He couldn't just leave her. He tried the knob and was surprised when it turned easily. "Dani," he called again as he pushed the door open. Panic raced through Zach when he spotted her lying in the tub, eyes closed, and her body seemingly limp. Without thinking, he rushed in, calling out her name again. She gasped and sat up all at once. Relief washed through Zach as he realized she was alive. "Are you all right?" He dropped to his knees beside the tub and cupped her head with one hand as he searched her face for clues. "Yeah. I'm fine. I must have fallen asleep." The relief that she'd not fallen and she was safe washed through Zach, but was quickly followed by frustration and anger. He knew neither would help, and he tried to hold them back. "You were sleeping in the tub? You should know how dangerous that is." "I do. I didn't mean to." Dani started to stand, then remembered she had no clothes on. "Can you hand me that towel?" She pointed to the rack next to the tub. "And give me a minute? I'll be right out." Zach wanted to yell, to rail at her about how careless and dangerous it was to sleep in a tub full of water, but managed to swallow the urge. "Sure." He grabbed the towel and handed it to her, careful not to let it trail into the water. "I'll be in the other room." He started to leave but stopped at the door. "I brought pizza, want me to serve?" he asked without turning back to look at her. He wasn't sure it would help things. "That would be great. I'll be right there." Water sloshed behind him as Zach stepped out of the bathroom and pulled the door closed behind him. He took a deep breath and forced himself to let it out slowly. She knew how stupid sleeping in the tub was. She'd told him she was tired, but maybe she hadn't realized how tired. After a couple deep breaths, he'd calmed enough he didn't want to barge back into the bathroom and give her hell. Instead, he went into the kitchen and pulled out a couple plates. A couple minutes later, Dani shuffled in, her hair still piled on top of her head where it had been in the tub, wearing sweatpants and a shirt that looked familiar. He looked at her a moment, then realized that they were his. The stuff he'd sent her home in the week before. He'd wondered at the time if he would get them back. It looked like not soon. He didn't mind, he liked seeing her in his clothes. Not now, he thought to himself as he glanced back down at the table. 2. He glanced up to find her shuffling to the refrigerator. 2 is good. She opened the door and dug for a moment, before closing the door and carrying something back. When he frowned, she held it up like a trophy. A plastic jar with a green label. Bali cheese. Her huge grin made him smile and shake his head. He'd forgotten what she called Parmesan cheese, and that she loved it on her pizza. She added a liberal amount to her food, then offered him the container. Zach used a little while she went to the fridge and pulled out a couple cans of Coke and brought them back. Dani handed him one can, picked up her plate, and tilted her head. "Come on." She headed into the living room. He knew they didn't normally eat in the living room, so this was kind of a big deal. Still smiling, he picked up his plate and the can of soda and followed her. Zach stopped beside the sofa and looked around. Dani sat on one end of the couch, one leg folded beneath her as she took a bite out of one slice. MMPH. She motioned around the room, and he took that to mean she was telling him to sit down. He made his way around the coffee table, set the can of soda down, using one hand to pop the top open before sitting beside her. Close but not too close. She was halfway through her first slice before she slowed down enough to pick up the remote and turn on the TV. It took her another minute or two to swallow enough to speak. "Want to watch something?" "I thought we might. I brought a couple movies." "What did you bring?" Her eyes lit in a way that let Zach know he'd sparked her interest. "I'm not telling. They're in the bag on the table. You can get them when you get more pizza." "What makes you think I'll get more?" Zach shot her a look that said she wasn't fooling him. "Since it's taken you about 2 minutes flat to polish off your first slice," he glanced down at her plate before continuing, "and you haven't eaten all day, you'll likely have more. Go for it. You need it." He turned to look at the TV, which was tuned to Netflix, and waiting for a profile to be chosen. She huffed but went back to eating. A moment later she got up, her plate empty. The bag on the table rustled and Dani let out an ear-splitting squeal, one he hadn't heard since their school days. He'd forgotten she used that screech when she was surprised or excited. Moments later she reappeared, her plate refilled and DVD cases in her other hand. "You remembered." The light in her eye and happiness on her face made it worth the temporary deafness. Zach just smiled and shook his head because she'd turned on Netflix but never started anything. He'd bought the movies because they were her favorites and he'd probably never admit it, but for years when he was feeling lonely or missing her, he'd watch them. "Which one first?" He held out his hand. "This one." She handed him one case, set the other aside, and picked up a slice and took a bite while he stood. Zach loaded the disc into the player and sat back down. The screen lit and they started rolling previews, and Zach turned and eyed Dani as she ate, staying silent until she looked up. "What?" "I was just wondering." "Wondering what?" "Why your two favorite movies are about blondes." She looked at him a moment, her eyes wide, then over at the screen where a preview was still playing, before looking back at him. "You're the first person to notice." "I don't know about that, probably just the first to say something. I wondered if you secretly wished you were blonde." He reached over and wrapped a stray tendril of her hair that hung near her face loosely around one finger. Her gaze dropped to her lap and he wondered if maybe he'd been right. "I'm glad you're not." Dani frowned, her gaze going right back to his face. "Why?" Zach played with that one strand of hair. As he twisted it around his finger, the backs of his fingers brushed against her cheek. "Because it was this that first caught my eye." He remembered the first day he saw her. Freshman year. She'd been walking down the hall in front of him, high ponytail bouncing, the length of it going halfway down her back, and looking so silky soft he'd clutched the straps of his backpack as he wanted to bury them into her hair instead. Then she had turned and he saw her face. He'd fallen instantly. It had taken him several months to gather the nerve to ask her out, but from the first moment he saw her, he'd loved her. He'd had a couple small crushes before that, but nothing like what he'd felt that day. Once they started dating, his feelings for her grew until he didn't know how something so big fit inside him. When her father had broken them up, he'd been shattered. Not that he let anyone see it. He knew now he'd never stopped loving her. The moment he'd seen her again and been sure it was her, that day in the coffee shop, everything he'd ever felt for her, everything he'd shoved deep inside, had come surging back. The feel of her skin brushing against his once more, along with the light sense of mint and rosemary, brought Zach back to the present, and he realized she was rubbing her cheek against his hand. The movement reminded him of a cat. He uncurled his fingers, unwinding her hair from the one, then cupped her face. Really? When was that? The first week of freshman year. That was my first week here. I know. I didn't then, but found out later. It took me a while to get up the nerve to ask you out. He gave her a small smile as he remembered how shy he'd been then. You know how long it took? Dani blinked. You asked me out for Valentine's Day. I didn't realize it had taken you that long though. She scooted closer until her legs brushed against his on the sofa, the preview still playing on the screen, forgotten. The first week of school? Really? She tilted her head to one side as she watched him. Really? Heat seeped through their clothes and he wanted to pull her closer but resisted, waiting for a cue from her. Any cue. I never knew. She leaned a little closer, her gaze dropped, and she seemed to be watching his mouth. This was it. He leaned in. Not too fast. He didn't want to push her, so he gave her time to pull away. When her eyes drifted closed and her lips parted, he knew she wasn't going to pull away. Zach covered her mouth with his, slowly at first, just tasting her. Then something changed. Her hand came up to cup his cheek, then slid around his neck. Her fingers burrowed into his hair and held on tight. I've missed this, he said, breaking the kiss. He gazed into her eyes from mere inches away, wondering what he'd done right to be back where he'd wanted to be for the last 10 years. In her arms. The only thing that would make this moment better would be to have 1,000 more just like it. Me too. She tried to pull him back down, but he resisted. Not here. He stood and picked her up, making her squeal and cling to him. He loved when she did that. Holding her snug against him, he carried her into her room and laid her on the bed, leaning down to softly kiss her lips once more. This is much better. It is. Now come here. She grabbed a handful of his shirt and pulled him closer. Hold on. I don't want to rush this. He skimmed one hand down her body, savoring the feel of her. When he reached her foot, he slid his hand back up, slowly teasing himself as much as her with only the slightest pressure. Please touch me. Dani's voice was breathy with need. I am touching you. No. Touch my skin. She started pulling at her clothes but stopped when Zach covered her hands with his. Let me. Zach took his time undressing her, one garment at a time as he took in every nuance, every change, because her body was burned into his memory. It had been the standard that no other woman he'd been with could live up to. As he removed each item of her clothes, he ran his hands and lips over her skin, kissing and teasing her and himself. He'd stripped her to her bra and underwear when she stopped him. I'm almost naked and you're fully dressed. And now it's my turn. She pushed his hands away and reached for the hem of his shirt. She lifted it off, then did some teasing of her own. By the time she reached for the button on his jeans, he wasn't sure how long he could last. He needed to take the upper hand again, if only to give himself a little time to calm some before he embarrassed himself worse than he had their first time. What? She paused, looking at his face. Zach shook his head, then decided why not. I was thinking back to our first time, in the back seat of my parents' Ford. He shook his head. I was green and had no control. You'd think after all this time I would have improved, but when it comes to you, my control abandons me. I don't want you to have any. Her voice was soft and breathy. I want you as desperate to touch me as I am to touch you. She feathered one hand over his ribs and down to the button on his jeans again. Come on. Give me the last of it. The last of what? Your control. He couldn't hold back any longer. She was what he wanted. All he wanted, and he couldn't deny such a simple request. They came together in a rush of sighs and moans until they both lay panting on top of the bed, a thin layer of sweat cooling on their skin. I thought maybe I was idolizing your memory, Zach said after he caught his breath. But I was wrong. Touching you is different. Different how? She didn't sound angry, more curious. I'm not sure if I can explain. He sighed. I've been with a lot of women. I don't know, I guess I tried to find someone to replace you, but no one measured up. No one compared to you, and I didn't know why. Do you now? Yeah, I think I do. Then tell me, because I think I do too, but I'm not sure. Zach picked up his head and looked at her a moment, meeting her gaze. Because with everyone else, it was just physical. Sometimes there was chemistry and that helped, but I've never loved anyone else. Never cared for anyone as much as I care for you. The muscles in his neck throbbed, but there was no way he'd give up on seeing her reaction. She was quiet for several seconds. That was about what I'd decided. She never lifted her head but kept eye contact. For a long time, I thought I hated you. I tried to hate you for leaving us. But I was fooling myself. I always hoped somewhere deep inside that you'd come back. If I'd known, wild horses couldn't have dragged me away. I thought I was doing what you wanted. I know. She looked up at the ceiling, but she reached for him. When her hand found his, she clutched it tight, as if she was afraid he'd leave again. What now? Now? Zach sighed. We've proven to ourselves how we feel. What we need to do is decide what we want and how badly we want it. What do you mean? Do you want a relationship with me? Or has the last few weeks just been convenient because I'm taking care of Mark while you work, and doing what I can to help in general? He held his breath, half afraid she would say no. I wouldn't do that to you. Or to me. If I didn't want something with you, we wouldn't be here now. The heavy ball of worry in Zach's stomach eased some. He'd been willing to take anything he could get with Dani, and had been afraid to ask, much less pull for more than she might be willing to give. He hesitated a second, unsure if he was about to scare her off, then decided Dani had never scared easily. We can take this slow, if it's what you want. But I feel like we've waited long enough. I want it all. I want Mark. I want you. I want you both under my roof full-time. But that's not all. He fell silent, wondering how to ask this. What else could you want? She asked. Zach rolled until he was on his stomach beside her, leaning up on his elbows so they were face to face. Marry me. There he'd gotten the words out. He held his breath, waiting. Her eyes went wide, surprised but not filled with panic. I'm serious. I still have the ring I bought, planning to ask you way back then. I still want you to have it. It's been the longest, hardest 10 years I can imagine not being with you. It can't be harder to stay together. He bit the inside of his lip as he waited. Dani stared at him a moment, her mouth opened but no sound came out. Zach's heart thundered in his ears and he held his breath, hoping she wouldn't turn him down. Tears pooled in her eyes and she nodded. Really? He'd been afraid to hope. Really? Dani grinned and reached for him. Zach moved and brushed his lips against hers. You've just made me the happiest man on earth. I'm right there with you. They came together again, each touch tender and caring. He couldn't wait until she was in his arms every night and legally his. Dani's sigh drew his attention as he ran his lips along the hollow of her throat and lower. He loved every sound she made and looked forward to a lifetime of it. "What are we doing here?" Zach looked over at Dani, where she sat in the passenger's seat of his pickup. "You want to tell him, or you want me to?" "Let's do it together." "Mark, you know how we're moving into your dad's house? We're getting married and going to be a family, right?" "Yeah." He rolled his eyes. "It's all anyone can talk about for the last week, it's not like I could miss it." "Well, Zach thought you might like to pick out some things for your room." Mark was quiet, but Zach saw his eyes go round in the rear-view mirror where he was watching the boy. "I thought you might like to pick out a quilt or not, that's up to you. But maybe posters or some things for the walls. I know moving again so soon isn't fun. And your mom and I are getting a lot of attention right now. We thought you might like something for you. Can I get some Legos? Aren't there enough in the playroom?" Dani didn't sound excited. "But those are Dad's. I want my own." "They're yours now too." Zach couldn't help but smile. "But you can get some if you like." "Woohoo!" They got out of the car and headed inside. Dani took Zach's hand and weaved her fingers between his. He looked over and found her smiling up at him as Mark talked a minute about what he wanted to put in his room. This was what he'd always wanted. There was little more he could ask for. He glanced at Mark to make sure he was waiting for them before stepping out into traffic in front of the store. Well, there was one other thing. He looked back to Dani and she smiled. Soon. A rush of heat and desire ran through him and made him shiver because she'd known exactly what he'd been thinking about. It didn't hurt that they discussed it the night before. More children. Mark deserved a sibling. Maybe more than one. Zach couldn't wait. He'd missed being there for Mark, but he wouldn't this time around. Or ever again. He was never letting anything come between them again. Thank you for reading Sultry Nights. Check out the last book in the Pelican Lake series, Sizzling Summer Reunion. Find the rest of Melissa's books, including series and reading orders, on Melissa's website http://melissastevens.us. Stay on top of all the news, new releases, and receive exclusive early release offers and giveaway information by joining Melissa's VIP reader list.